What makes a man who lived through 2 world wars, endured the shadow of communism, stood before global leaders, embraced modern science and technology, and yet knelt in silent prayer before the blessed sacrament? A saint. What makes a man who once acted in underground plays to preserve his culture, later become a pope who shaped global history, dismantled ideologies with truth and love, and pointed the way to Christ with unwavering clarity? What makes this man not only a pope, not only a leader, but a saint, someone who burned with holiness in the middle of the modern world? In a century filled with brutality and confusion, this man stood tall, not with weapons or armies, but with a staff in hand, a rosary in his pocket, and the gospel in his heart. His was a voice that thundered across nations and whispered into the depths of the soul, "Be not afraid." This is not merely the story of a world leader. This is the story of Karol Wojtyla, known to the world as Pope John Paul II, now canonized as Saint John Paul II. But more than his title, what truly defined him was the fire of faith that never dimmed. Through sorrow, persecution, and physical suffering. This is a story of a man who loved deeply, suffered silently, forgave radically, and lived boldly for Christ. Because behind the pictures of cheering crowds, behind the bulletproof Pope mobile, behind the papal vestments and global influence, there was a man, a son, a student, a priest, whose journey to sainthood was paved with immense loss, heroic virtue, and a divine calling. It's easy to think saints are distant figures, people of the ancient past who lived in caves or preached in dusty deserts. But John Paul II walked among us. He lived in a time of photographs, television broadcasts, jet travel, and even the internet. His papacy spanned the years many of us remember vividly. He wasn't a mythical figure. He was real. And yet, his life was marked by something profoundly beyond this world. How did a Polish boy from a small town become a spiritual father to the world? What spiritual fire kept him preaching even when disease ravaged his body? And what can his legacy teach us about living boldly for Christ today? Welcome to Biblescope, where we find light, truth, and purpose in the faith of the saints. You've joined our Saints of the Church series, where we dive into the remarkable lives of holy men and women whose stories continue to echo across time, calling us higher. Saints who didn't just believe the gospel, but embodied it. From their sacrifices and victories to their human weaknesses and heavenly triumphs, we tell their stories, not as distant legends, but as fellow pilgrims who walked the narrow path and found eternal joy. Saints who remind us that holiness is not an unreachable ideal, but a lived reality. So if you're hungry to grow in your faith, if you long for examples of courage, mercy, prayer, and unwavering truth, if you wonder how to live for Christ in a modern world that seems to pull us in every direction, this video is for you. Make sure to like this video, subscribe to our channel, and tap the bell icon so you don't miss future stories of saints whose lives still change lives. And most of all, stay with us until the end, because the story of Saint John Paul II is not just a timeline of events or a list of accomplishments. It's a living testament to the fact that grace can transform a man into a beacon for nations. It's a divine narrative of how God raises up saints in every era, even ours. And it's a reminder that the greatest revolutions in history often begin with a soul surrendered to Christ. Picture it, a small boy named Karol, born in 1920 in a quiet Polish town called Wadowis. His mother dies when he's just 8. His brother soon after. His father becomes his rock. And then he too passes away when Karol is only 20. Alone, with no living family left, Karol could have become bitter, angry, even lost. Instead, he turns inward, not into himself, but into God. This boy, who once served as an altar server in his parish, who once skied down the snow-covered hills of Poland, who once dreamed of acting on stage, was already being shaped by sorrow. But not just sorrow, by grace. He would later say, "In the designs of providence, there are no mere coincidences." During the Nazi occupation of Poland, when the seminaries were shut down and priests were hunted, Karol studied in secret, under cover of night in an underground seminary. His call to the priesthood was forged in darkness, and yet shone with undeniable light. This hidden beginning would become a pattern of his life. Holiness, courage, and truth formed not in comfort, but in confrontation with evil. And then, against all odds, this hidden seminarian would become a priest, then a bishop, then a cardinal, and finally, in 1978, he would become the 264th Pope of the Catholic Church, the first non-Italian pope in 455 years, the youngest pope in over a century. And when he stood on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica that October evening, the crowd didn't know what to expect from this unknown cardinal from behind the Iron Curtain. But then he spoke, and the world was never the same. Be not afraid. 3 simple words, but filled with power. Words that would become the theme of his entire pontificate. Words that echoed what Christ had told his disciples again and again. Words that pierced through the fear of war, communism, moral confusion, and despair. He would go on to visit 129 countries, embrace children, challenge dictators, kneel in the dirt with the poor, write theology that touched the soul, and suffer, publicly, painfully, heroically, as Parkinson's disease slowly broke down his body, even as his spirit remained unshaken. He forgave the man who tried to assassinate him. He wept with the broken. He brought the message of divine mercy to the world. He drew millions of young people to Christ through the creation of World Youth Day. He stood for life, for truth, and for the infinite dignity of every human being, from the unborn to the elderly. This is not just the story of a leader. This is the story of a saint. And the holiness of St. John Paul II wasn't some unattainable thing locked away in a Vatican vault. It was holiness rooted in prayer, forged through suffering, and lived out in daily faithfulness. This is what makes his legacy so powerful and so relevant today. Because in an age where fear is loud and hope is scarce, his words still ring out like a trumpet. Do not be afraid. Open wide the doors to Christ. So here's our invitation to you. Don't just watch this as a history lesson. Watch it as a journey into the heart of a saint. Open yourself to what God might be calling you to through this man's witness. Could it be courage in the face of fear? Mercy in the face of hate? Truth in the face of compromise? As we unfold this story together, take time to reflect. What might holiness look like in your life? In your suffering? In your vocation? St. John Paul II's life was a long, faithful yes to God, and yours can be too. Stay with us as we tell the story of a man who became a sign of contradiction to the world and a signpost to heaven. A man who gave his life for truth, who suffered for love, and who showed the world what it means to live unafraid. Because his story isn't over. It continues in every heart that takes up the cross and follows Christ with boldness. Welcome to the journey. Wadowice, Poland, a small, quiet town nestled at the foot of the Carpathian Mountains. It was here, on May 18, 1920, that a child was born who would one day shape the course of the 20th century, not with weapons or politics, but with prayer, perseverance, and divine purpose. His name was Karol Josef Wojtyla. From the very beginning, his life would be marked by profound sorrow, but also profound grace. As we trace the early years of St. John Paul II's life, we don't just discover a boy growing up in rural Poland. We discover how God began to shape a soul in silence, how suffering became sacred, how holiness was born, not on a grand stage, but in the hidden, humble rhythms of ordinary life. Childhood in Wadowice. Karol grew up in a devout Catholic household. His father, Karol Wojtyla Sr., was a former army officer turned tailor. His mother, Emilia, was a deeply faithful and nurturing woman, known for her gentle nature and constant prayer. The family lived modestly, but with a sense of warmth, structure, and quiet dignity. The young Karol, known to friends as Lolek, was full of energy. He loved playing soccer, hiking in the mountains, skiing in the winter, and even swimming in the Skawa River near his home. He was bright and inquisitive, excelling in school and earning the admiration of teachers and classmates alike. But while his childhood held moments of light, it was also quickly shadowed by loss. When Carol was just 8 years old, his mother died of heart and kidney complications. He would later say that he had lost his mother's face forever. A mere 3 years later, his only sibling, Edmund, a young doctor, died while caring for a patient suffering from scarlet fever. The loss was devastating. Carol was now left with just his father, a quiet, noble man of deep faith. And the two would grow even closer in their shared grief. In a world where so many people turn bitter in the face of tragedy, Carol did something different. He turned inward, not into himself, but into God. His father became his model of virtue and discipline. A man of prayer and moral strength, Carol Sr. would kneel at his bedside every night, whispering prayers by candlelight. Carol often woke up in the middle of the night to find his father deep in prayer, kneeling, unmoving, hands clasped in silent intercession. Years later, Carol would say, "My father was the person who explained God to me. He was a man of great silence and deep prayer. He never pressured me to become a priest, but he made holiness seem both natural and necessary." Through his father's quiet witness, Carol learned that faith wasn't just for Sundays. It was a way of life. Prayer was not an obligation, it was a lifeline. As he grew, Carol immersed himself in study, culture, and philosophy. He showed a remarkable talent for languages, eventually becoming fluent in Polish, Latin, Italian, French, German, Spanish, and English. But there was one passion that burned especially bright during his youth: theater and literature. Carol loved words. He wrote poems, read Shakespeare, memorized long passages of Polish drama. He joined a theatrical troupe and began to act in plays, many of them patriotic or religious in nature. On stage, he found a way to preserve Polish culture during a time when it was being threatened by outside forces. For Carol, theater wasn't just entertainment. It was a form of resistance, a way to keep truth, beauty, and national identity alive under the pressure of foreign ideologies. It was also a way to explore the great questions of human existence. Who are we? Why do we suffer? What does it mean to be human? These weren't just academic questions for Carol. They were the questions of his own life, a life shaped by death, struggle, and longing. But nothing would challenge his life or his faith more than what came next: the Nazi occupation and secret seminary. In 1939, Germany invaded Poland, unleashing a wave of horror that would plunge Europe into the nightmare of World War II. Carol was 19. The Nazis immediately began targeting intellectuals, clergy, Jews, and anyone who represented resistance to their ideology. Schools were shut down. Churches were watched. Seminarians and priests were arrested, deported, or executed. Carol enrolled at Jagiellonian University in Krakow to study literature and philosophy, but the university was soon closed by the Gestapo. Determined to support himself and avoid deportation, Carol worked in a quarry and later in a chemical plant. These backbreaking jobs left him physically exhausted, but they also deepened his sense of solidarity with the working class. It was during these years, between the death of his father in 1941 and the brutalities of the Nazi regime, that Carol began to discern a deeper calling. He had already lost his entire family. His country was under siege. His people were being annihilated. And yet, in the midst of this darkness, Carol heard a quiet voice, a call to the priesthood. But answering that call wasn't simple. To study for the priesthood meant risking his life. And so, under the direction of Archbishop Adam Sapieha, Carol entered the underground seminary in Krakow. Hidden in plain sight, he continued working at the factory by day and studied theology by night. He read the church fathers, prayed the breviary, and began a life of ascetic discipline. His formation was not in a monastery or grand seminary halls, but in basements, back rooms, and candlelit chapels. It was a time of great interior growth, a time of silence, of contemplation, of suffering, a time when Carol encountered Christ, not just in doctrine, but in the crucible of real-world persecution. Later, he would reflect, "I became a priest under German occupation during a time of great suffering. That suffering gave me a deeper understanding of the cross. and of the mystery of God's presence in the midst of evil. Carroll's love for humanity, his intellectual strength, his empathy for the suffering, and his profound Marian devotion, these all blossomed in these hidden years of prayer and perseverance. It's easy to romanticize the early lives of saints, imagining signs and wonders from the beginning. But Carroll's early holiness was quiet, hidden, and deeply human. No bichens, no dramatic kimberschens, just a soul being shaped by grief, by beauty, and by a deep love for God. A reflection, calling in the midst of grief and oppression. Let's pause here. What does it mean to find one's calling in the midst of grief? How do you follow God when everything in your life is falling apart? Carroll didn't choose a path of escape. He didn't numb his pain with distraction. He let his wounds lead him to the wounded Christ. This is the mystery of holiness. Sometimes, God forms saints not through grand moments, but through ordinary faithfulness in seasons of suffering. When everything is stripped away, your family, your comfort, your future plans, what remains? For Carroll, what remained was prayer. What remained was the Eucharist. What remained was the voice of Christ calling him to go deeper. And it was in that hidden seminary, under the constant threat of death, that a young man said yes to a future he could not yet see, a future that would take him from that underground formation to the chair of St. Peter. We often think our calling will come in comfort, in clarity, in calm. But Carroll's life shows us that sometimes God speaks most powerfully in the storm. By 1946, Carroll Wojtyla would be ordained a priest, but the foundation of his sanctity had already been laid. In his losses, in his silence, in the hidden places. He learned to carry the cross before he ever preached about it. He learned to forgive before he ever sat in the confessional. He learned to lead by being led by the Holy Spirit through suffering into a deeper surrender. It was the fall of 1946. The smoke of World War II still hung heavy over Europe. Cities were ruined, families shattered, millions dead. But in a quiet chapel in Krakow, something eternal was taking place. A young man knelt before the altar, hands folded, heart surrendered, as the oil of ordination was poured upon him. That young man was Carroll Wojtyla, and on November 1st, 1946, he was ordained a priest by Cardinal Adam Sapieha, the same man who had secretly nurtured him through the underground seminary during the Nazi occupation. In a world still trembling from the shock of war, Carroll became a priest not as an escape, but as a commission, a sacred vow to bring light into the darkness. He had walked through the valley of death, and now he would carry the gospel with the authority of heaven and the fire of one who had learned to trust God in suffering. This was the beginning of his priestly mission, but peace would not last long, for Poland's wounds were still fresh, and another oppressive shadow was quickly spreading across the land. This time, it wasn't the swastika, it was the hammer and sickle. After the war, Poland fell under the control of the Soviet-backed communist regime, a government that viewed religion, especially Catholicism, as a threat to state control. Churches were monitored, priests were spied on, religious education was censored. The aim was clear: silence the church, reprogram the people, and redefine the soul of the nation. But Carroll Wojtyla was no ordinary priest. He didn't resist the regime with weapons or marches. Instead, he resisted with something more dangerous: truth. He taught students in hidden lectures. He organized hiking trips that doubled as theological formation. He celebrated the sacraments in forests and fields when churches were too closely watched. He prayed. He listened. He quietly formed a generation of young people to resist, not with violence, but with virtue. He showed them that true freedom is interior, that even behind iron bars, the soul can be free when it is anchored in Christ. In the surveillance reports later uncovered, communist informants described him as unbreakable, intellectual, and dangerously influential. But Carroll never responded with fear. He knew this was the cost of being a priest in such times: to be watched, to be threatened, to suffer. And yet he pressed on, with joy, with gentleness, with strength drawn from prayer. He once wrote, "A priest must always be with his people, especially in times of trial. He cannot run. He must walk with them, bleed with them, and lead them." This wasn't theoretical for Carroll. It was real. He lived under surveillance. His homilies were recorded. His friends were interrogated. And yet, he never compromised the truth of the gospel. He knew that the human person was not made for the state, but for God. And this conviction would form the bedrock of one of his greatest contributions to the church and the world, his theology of the human person. Carroll's early ministry was shaped not only by persecution, but by deep philosophical and theological reflection. He had suffered loss, injustice, and seen evil firsthand. But instead of becoming bitter, he asked the question, "What is man, that you are mindful of him?" Psalm 8 verse 4. In the years following his ordination, he began to write and teach about the dignity of the human person, a dignity that no government, no ideology, and no circumstance could erase. He argued that each human life was sacred, made in the image of God, with an inherent worth that could never be taken away, no matter how broken the body, how oppressed the soul, or how forgotten by the world. This was not mere theology, it was a revolution. Because in a world that had just witnessed the Holocaust and was now being suffocated by communism, Carroll Wojtyla dared to declare that every human being mattered. After the war, Poland fell under the control of the Soviet-backed communist regime, a government that viewed religion, especially Catholicism, as a threat to state control. Churches were monitored, priests were spied on, religious education was censored. The aim was clear: silence the church, reprogram the people, and redefine the soul of the nation. But Carroll Wojtyla was no ordinary priest. He didn't resist the regime with weapons or marches. Instead, he resisted with something more dangerous: truth. He taught students in hidden lectures. He organized hiking trips that doubled as theological formation. He celebrated the sacraments in forests and fields when churches were too closely watched. He prayed. He listened. He quietly formed a generation of young people to resist, not with violence, but with virtue. He showed them that true freedom is interior, that even behind iron bars, the soul can be free when it is anchored in Christ. In the surveillance reports later uncovered, communist informants described him as unbreakable, intellectual, and dangerously influential. But Carroll never responded with fear. He knew this was the cost of being a priest in such times: to be watched, to be threatened, to suffer. And yet he pressed on, with joy, with gentleness, with strength drawn from prayer. He once wrote, "A priest must always be with his people, especially in times of trial. He cannot run. He must walk with them, bleed with them, and lead them." This wasn't theoretical for Carroll. It was real. He lived under surveillance. His homilies were recorded. His friends were interrogated. And yet, he never compromised the truth of the gospel. He knew that the human person was not made for the state, but for God. And this conviction would form the bedrock of one of his greatest contributions to the church and the world, his theology of the human person. Carroll's early ministry was shaped not only by persecution, but by deep philosophical and theological reflection. He had suffered loss, injustice, and seen evil firsthand. But instead of becoming bitter, he asked the question, "What is man, that you are mindful of him?" Psalm 8 verse 4. In the years following his ordination, he began to write and teach about the dignity of the human person, a dignity that no government, no ideology, and no circumstance could erase. He argued that each human life was sacred, made in the image of God, with an inherent worth that could never be taken away, no matter how broken the body, how oppressed the soul, or how forgotten by the world. This was not mere theology, it was a revolution. Because in a world that had just witnessed the Holocaust and was now being suffocated by communism, Carroll Wojtyla dared to declare that every human being mattered. Though not always publicized, there were moments in Carroll Wojtyla's early ministry that seemed marked by divine protection. During one resistance campaign, it's reported that he narrowly escaped arrest after being followed by secret police. On another occasion, while walking alone at night, he was nearly struck by a speeding vehicle, but was pulled back by an unseen hand just moments before impact. Some say it was coincidence. Others say it was providence. But Carroll himself believed that his life was not his own, that God had preserved him not for comfort, but for a mission. "I am convinced," he once said, "that every moment of my life has been guided by the hand of God, for a purpose I do not yet fully see." And that purpose was beginning to unfold. He had suffered under Nazism. He had endured under communism. He had studied in secret and taught in silence. He had shepherded a persecuted flock with tenderness and strength. And now, the church and the world were beginning to take notice. In 1978, the world would watch in awe as this man, this priest from behind the Iron Curtain, was called to a stage greater than any he could have imagined. But before the white cassock, before the world travels, before the crowds and cameras, there was this, a man who suffered, served, and loved in the shadows. And that is where true sainthood begins. October 16th, 1978. The white smoke rose above the Sistine Chapel. The bells of St. Peter's rang out. The crowd gathered in St. Peter's Square held their breath as the name was announced. Karol Wojtyla, a Polish bishop, virtually unknown to much of the world, had just been elected the 264th Pope of the Catholic Church, the first non-Italian pope in 455 years. He stepped onto the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica and addressed the world, not with lofty political proclamations, but with a clear and thunderous invitation. Non abbiate paura. Be not afraid. Open wide the doors to Christ. And with that, a new chapter in church history began, one that would span 26 years, shake global powers, inspire generations, and carry the wounds of Christ into every corner of the earth. This was not a papacy of comfort. It was a papacy of courage and of mercy. To many, the election of Karol Wojtyla seemed almost impossible. He was not Italian. He came from behind the Iron Curtain, from a land still chained under communism. He had lived under Nazi terror, then under Soviet oppression. His name was difficult to pronounce, his background unfamiliar. And yet, he had something the world desperately needed: moral clarity, spiritual strength, a heart ablaze with mercy. His first homily as Pope, delivered in St. Peter's Square, rang out not just as a greeting, but as a mission statement for his pontificate. Brothers and sisters, do not be afraid to welcome Christ and accept his power. Do not be afraid. Christ knows what is in man. He alone knows it. These words would echo throughout his papacy, words that were not just brave, but prophetic, because fear ruled much of the world in 1978. Fear of nuclear war, fear of political oppression, fear of moral collapse, fear of a church shrinking into silence. But Pope John Paul II did not shrink. He stood, he spoke, he walked into the world, not to condemn it, but to ignite it. Most popes before him remained largely in Rome, but John Paul II believed that the shepherd should smell like his sheep. And so, he went out into the highways and byways of the modern world. By the end of his papacy, he had visited 129 countries. No pope in history had traveled more. No one had brought the face of Christ to more nations, more languages, more people. He stood in slums. He walked through war zones. He knelt at holy shrines. He greeted presidents and prisoners alike. He went to the Philippines, where over 4 million gathered for Mass. Africa, where he hugged children orphaned by AIDS. The Middle East, where he prayed at the Western Wall and sought reconciliation between Jews, Christians, and Muslims. Latin America, where he championed the dignity of the poor. The United States, where he challenged a culture of death with the gospel of life. And Poland, oh yes, Poland, his homeland, where he sparked a revolution not with guns, but with truth. Freedom is not given to us by the state, he declared. It is a gift from God. And when he spoke those words in Warsaw in 1979, something began to break loose in Eastern Europe. The people of Poland began to chant, "We want God." The solidarity movement took fire. The world watched, and the Iron Curtain began to crack. Historians have called him one of the central figures in the fall of communism in Eastern Europe. But he never lifted a weapon. His power came from prayer, presence, and truth. His 1979 visit to Poland is now seen as a turning point in the Cold War. When he stood before millions of his countrymen and invoked the Holy Spirit, he wasn't just speaking to the faithful. He was challenging an empire. Let your spirit descend. Let your spirit descend and renew the face of the earth, this earth. And slowly, things began to change. The Berlin Wall would fall in 1989. The Soviet Union would collapse 2 years later. The regimes that tried to erase God were being swept away. Even world leaders like Ronald Reagan and Mikhail Gorbachev acknowledged Pope John Paul II's influence, not as a politician, but as a moral force. Yet his greatest power wasn't in changing systems. It was in changing hearts. And that power was most visible in the most harrowing moment of his papacy, the assassination attempt. It was an ordinary Wednesday. The Pope was riding in an open-air vehicle through St. Peter's Square, greeting pilgrims with joy. And then, gunshots. 2 bullets pierced his body. He collapsed into the arms of his aides. Blood soaked his white cassock. Chaos erupted. The world held its breath. For days, he hovered between life and death. He underwent hours of surgery, and the church prayed like never before. Miraculously, he survived. But what came next stunned the world even more. Just 2 years later, Pope John Paul II visited the prison cell of the man who tried to kill him, Mehmet Ali Agca. He sat with him, spoke to him, held his hand, and then he forgave him. The 2 men, an assassin and a pope, sat in silence and conversation, not as enemies, but as brothers. Later, the Pope said, one hand fired the gun, another guided the bullet. He believed that Our Lady of Fatima, whose feast day coincided with the shooting, had interceded to spare his life. And so, in gratitude, he placed the bullet in her crown at the shrine in Fatima, Portugal. This act of mercy defined him, not as a man of vengeance, but as a man of forgiveness, a man of divine mercy. One of the most profound devotions of John Paul II's pontificate was his promotion of divine mercy, a message revealed to another Polish saint, Sister Faustina Kowalska, in the early 20th century. For years, the devotion to divine mercy had been suppressed. But John Paul II knew the world needed this message now more than ever. He canonized Saint Faustina in the year 2000, the first saint of the new millennium. And he instituted the Feast of Divine Mercy, celebrated each year on the Sunday after Easter. He declared, "This is the happiest day of my life." Why? Because he knew the heart of the gospel is mercy. That in a world scarred by war, hatred, abortion, division, and despair, the only answer is the merciful love of Christ. He wrote, "There is no peace without justice, and no justice without forgiveness." And he lived that forgiveness again and again. Even in his final years, as his body was broken by Parkinson's disease, his message remained the same. Mercy, mercy, mercy. Though he was an elderly pope, frail, bent, and at times barely able to walk, he had a heart that beat young. He loved young people, not as future members of the church, but as its present strength. He met with youth around the world, encouraging them to live lives of holiness, purpose, and joy. And in 1985, he launched one of the most powerful movements in modern Catholic history, World Youth Day. From Rome to Rio, Toronto to Krakow, millions of young people gathered to pray, sing, learn, and encounter Christ. He told them, "You are not the sum of your weaknesses and failures. You are the sum of the Father's love for you. Do not be afraid to be saints." He challenged a generation to reject mediocrity and embrace the radical adventure of following Jesus. They called him JP2, "We love you." And even when his hands trembled and his voice cracked, he showed them what it meant to suffer with dignity, to pray with power, and to finish the race with joy. 26 years, over 100 apostolic visits, 14 encyclicals, hundreds of saints canonized, 1 billion lives touched. Pope John Paul II was more than a leader. He was a father, a witness, a sign of contradiction in a world chasing comfort and forgetting God. He stood firm against the culture of death. He upheld the dignity of every person, from the unborn to the elderly, from prisoners to the sick. He reminded the world that truth and mercy are not enemies, but allies. That faith is not a private hobby, but a public witness. That holiness is not outdated, but desperately needed. And even as his body failed, his spirit soared. The world watched as he stumbled, as he slurred his words, as he suffered. But they also saw something else, the face of Christ, the face of a man who had given everything, and who would soon return to the Father. As the years passed, the once athletic, hiking, skiing, and kayaking Pope grew slower, weaker. His steps became measured, his hands began to tremble, his speech slurred. And yet, he did not retreat. He did not hide his decline. St. John Paul II chose to suffer in the light. He stood before the world, weakened but unashamed, allowing his body to bear witness to what he had taught his entire life. That suffering has meaning, and that the human person never loses dignity, even in weakness. He had spoken of it in sermons, encyclicals, and private letters. But in his final years, he lived it. Yet even as his health waned, his intellectual legacy burned brighter than ever. Among the towering contributions of his papacy, one shines with exceptional brilliance and enduring relevance. Between 1979 and 1984, Pope John Paul II delivered a series of 129 weekly teachings at his Wednesday audiences, talks that would later be compiled into a work now known as the Theology of the Body. To many, this was revolutionary. In a world increasingly confused about identity, sexuality, love, and vocation, he gave a vision rooted not in culture, but in creation, not in fleeting desire, but in divine design. He began with Genesis, in the beginning, and unfolded the mystery of the human body as a sign, a sacrament, a language through which God speaks. The body, and it alone, he wrote, is capable of making visible what is invisible, the spiritual and the divine. In these teachings, he affirmed that every human person, male and female, is created in the image and likeness of God, that our bodies are not objects, but sacred vessels meant for love and communion, that sexuality, when rightly understood, points toward the mystery of God's love, that marriage reflects Christ's union with the Church, that celibacy is not a denial of love, but a sign of its eternal fulfillment. Rather than condemning the body, he exalted it, not as something shameful, but as holy, with a spousal meaning, made to give and receive love in freedom and truth. It wasn't a moral lecture. It was a song, a hymn to the beauty of being human. In an age of confusion, exploitation, and wounded identities, John Paul II gave us a roadmap back to the garden and forward to heaven. His teachings continue to shape theology, marriage preparation, youth ministry, and personal conversion across the globe. They remind us we are not accidents. We are loved, and our bodies matter. As he entered the twilight of his life, John Paul II became a living icon of the suffering Christ. Diagnosed with Parkinson's disease in the early 1990s, the Pope who had once climbed mountains and skied with ease now struggled to lift his arms, speak clearly, or even walk unaided. Many suggested he should resign, that he should preserve his dignity and step down. But he refused. Christ had not come down from the cross, he said. Why should I? He would continue to serve, to bless, to speak, even if with great effort, until his last breath. His suffering was not hidden behind closed Vatican doors. It was public, painful, and profound. On Good Friday, as the world gathered for the Stations of the Cross at the Colosseum in Rome, the cameras panned not to the crowds, but to the Pope alone in his private chapel, clutching a crucifix against his chest, unable to walk but deeply united to the passion of Christ. He did not speak, but he preached volumes. In his silent suffering, he became the voice for the aged, the sick, the forgotten, and the dying. He showed the world that suffering does not steal dignity, it reveals it. That every life, no matter how broken or limited, has worth. that the cross is not the end, but the beginning of glory. John Paul II's papal motto was Totus Tuus, totally yours. It was a prayer of consecration to the Virgin Mary, inspired by the teachings of St. Louis Delaware Montfort. He believed that through Mary, we are led perfectly to Christ. In his final days, as he grew weaker, this devotion did not fade. It intensified. As his voice failed, he would look to the icon of Our Lady of Czestochowa, the Black Madonna of Poland, and entrust his suffering to her care. Even his final words, as reported by his attendants, were whispered in Polish. "Let me go to the house of the Father." And so, on the evening of April 2nd, 2005, on the vigil of Divine Mercy Sunday, Pope John Paul II breathed his last. The bells of Rome tolled. The crowds wept. The world stood still. He had walked with us for nearly 27 years as Pope, and now he walked home. The morning that followed his death was unlike anything the Church had seen in generations. Over 3 million people flooded to Rome to pay their respects. Young people held vigil in the streets. Candles, prayers, tears, and chants of Santo Subito, Saint Now, filled the night air. The call for his canonization was immediate, universal, and deeply felt. Pope Benedict XVI waived the usual 5-year waiting period for the process to begin. In 2011, John Paul II was beatified, just 6 years after his death. And on April 27, 2014, Divine Mercy Sunday, he was officially declared a saint by Pope Francis, with Pope Emeritus Benedict XVI in attendance. It was the first time in history that 2 living popes were present at the canonization of a former pope. By his witness of faith, love, and courage, Pope Francis said, John Paul II remains a great son of his homeland, Poland, and a great pope of the Church. 2 miracles were officially recognized in the process of canonization. Sister Marie Simon-Pierre, a French nun suffering from advanced Parkinson's, the same disease that afflicted the Pope, was miraculously healed after praying for his intercession shortly after his death. Floribeth Mora Diaz, a Costa Rican woman diagnosed with a terminal brain aneurysm, was healed after praying to John Paul II. The healing was instantaneous and medically inexplicable. But beyond these, countless testimonies continue to pour in from around the world. Healings, conversions, reconciliations, and moments of deep spiritual transformation. He may have died, but his mission lives on. John Paul II's life, suffering, and sanctity continue to shine as a beacon of hope in a confused and wounded world. What does his legacy teach us? First, that the human person is sacred, not because of strength or success, but because we are made in the image of God. From the unborn to the elderly, every life is precious. Second, that suffering has meaning. It is not the end. It is a participation in the redemptive love of Christ. Third, that mercy is the heartbeat of the gospel. Without mercy, there is no justice, no healing, no future. Fourth, that truth and freedom walk hand in hand. Real freedom is not license to do anything. It is the capacity to choose what is good, beautiful, and true. And finally, that holiness is possible. Even in our modern world, with its distractions, sins, and noise, saints are still being raised up. He showed us that you can be a scholar and a mystic, a leader and a servant, a philosopher and a shepherd, a sufferer and a saint. In the designs of providence, he once said, there are no mere coincidences. Everything in his life, from the pain of his childhood to the trials of war to the halls of the Vatican, was part of a divine story being written. And now, his legacy is part of ours. St. John Paul II did not just leave behind books, speeches, or photographs. He left behind a path, a living example for the world to follow. Not a celebrity, not just a historical figure, but a man who showed us, with every breath, how to live for God in a broken world. He proved that holiness isn't something reserved for ancient desert monks or cloistered nuns. Holiness is not some faraway ideal for a different age. Holiness is possible, here, now, in our time, in our world. But how? Let us look deeply into what this modern saint teaches us, not just with his words, but with his life. Perhaps one of the most iconic and deeply personal traits of St. John Paul II was his unwavering love and devotion to the Blessed Virgin Mary. From the earliest days of his priesthood, and even before, he found in Mary a mother, a guide, and a protector. In fact, it was during his seminary days, while hiding from Nazi authorities and studying in secret, that he read St. Louis Delaware Montfort's True Devotion to Mary, a book that would forever shape his soul. From it, he drew his lifelong motto, Totus tuus ego sum. I'm totally yours. These were not empty words. This was a daily consecration, a surrendering of his life, his work, his mission, his sufferings, his joys, his body and soul, entirely to Mary, so that she could shape him more fully into the image of her Son. His papal coat of arms even bore the bold M beneath the cross, signifying Mary at the foot of Christ's passion and at the center of his own. In times of confusion, he turned to her. In times of mission, he walked with her. And in his darkest hour, when he was shot in St. Peter's Square, he said it was Mary who guided the bullet away from his heart. To Mary, I entrust the whole church. To her, I entrust my service in the church. To her, I entrust my whole being. This Marian devotion wasn't superstition. It wasn't sentimentality. It was deeply theological. He understood what the church has always taught, that Mary does not replace Christ, but she leads us perfectly to him. To imitate John Paul II is to entrust ourselves to Mary, not because she is the end, but because she is the surest way to the heart of Jesus. And so we ask, what would it mean to say totus tuus in your life? What if you handed everything over to Mary, not as a form of loss, but as the beginning of true transformation? There was no single dimension to St. John Paul II. He was not a saint of one gift or strength. He was a man whose entire life was unified under grace. He was a man of deep prayer. He would spend hours in Eucharistic adoration. His daily Mass was the heartbeat of his day. Even in his travels, he made time to kneel, face to the ground, in prayer. Many aides would enter his chapel late at night or early in the morning and find him prostrate before the Blessed Sacrament, whispering names, intentions, nations, and cries of the world to the one he loved most. He was also a man of remarkable intellect. He held 2 doctorates, taught university philosophy, and wrote with extraordinary clarity and depth on theology, ethics, and anthropology. But unlike some intellectuals, his knowledge did not make him cold or distant. It fueled his compassion. He engaged with the world's greatest thinkers, not to prove superiority, but to seek truth together. And when he met the poor, the sick, the dying, or the lonely, he bent down. He touched hands. He looked into eyes. He cried with them. One story tells of a trip to an African nation where he saw a child dying of starvation. The cameras tried to rush him past, but John Paul II stopped. He knelt. He blessed the child, and he wept. This is what made him a man of courage. Not just his strength to confront communism or to travel endlessly, but the courage to let his heart break, to feel the world's wounds and respond with love. Man cannot live without love, he said. He remains a being that is incomprehensible for himself. His life is senseless if love is not revealed to him, if he does not encounter love. To imitate John Paul II is to be a whole person, praying deeply, thinking clearly, loving sacrificially, and serving with fearless tenderness. The modern world often feels like a flood, rushing with distractions, divided by ideologies, drowning in doubt. And yet, John Paul II didn't retreat from this world. He walked into it with light. He didn't wait for the world to become perfect to proclaim the gospel. He proclaimed it precisely because the world was so broken. He showed us that to be Catholic is not to live in a cave, but to stand on the mountaintop and cry out truth in love. He urged Christians to engage culture, challenge politics, elevate art, protect life, and build civilization, not through violence or fear, but through holiness. Do not abandon yourselves to despair. We are the Easter people, and hallelujah is our song. What if we lived like that? What if your workplace, your home, your university, your neighborhood became your mission field? What if being Catholic didn't mean hiding your faith, but letting it radiate in every word and action? What if you refused to settle for comfort and instead chased sainthood? In every place he went, John Paul II carried a message the modern world desperately needed and still needs. Truth is not tyranny. Love is not tolerance. Suffering is not meaningless. Faith is not weakness. He taught that truth, spoken without love, becomes cruelty. But love, divorced from truth, becomes sentimentality. Only together, truth and love, can hearts change. He did not compromise doctrine to be liked. He did not hide teachings to win applause. But neither did he wield truth like a weapon. He spoke with gentleness, with patience, with clarity, and he invited everyone, to encounter the God who is both just and merciful. Even in suffering, he stood as a sign of hope. He didn't cover his Parkinson's. He didn't flee from the cameras. He let the world see a pope who could no longer speak, but whose silence thundered louder than any words. He showed the world that the cross is not a contradiction of love. It is its fullest expression. And so, he asks you, even now, how do you carry your cross? Do you run from it? Or do you let Christ walk with you beneath its weight? Do you hide your wounds? Or do you offer them as a prayer? St. John Paul II didn't escape pain. He transformed it. And so can you. Perhaps the most important thing we can imitate is the same thing he prayed every morning. Totus tuus, totally yours. This is not a small prayer. It is not safe. It is a surrender. Totus tuus means, Mary, take my fears, take my plans, take my time, take my relationships, take my job, take my past, take my future. I give everything to Jesus through you. It is a declaration that your life is not your own, and that this is good news. Because when we give ourselves completely to God, we don't lose freedom, we gain purpose. When we give him control, we don't fall into chaos, we find peace. John Paul II lived totus tuus. And now, the same invitation is laid before you. So what will you do? Will you let your faith be passive, or will you let it set you on fire? Will you let your suffering define you, or refine you? Will you live as if you belong to yourself, or live as one who is totally his? St. John Paul II lived boldly. He loved fully. He suffered openly. He prayed deeply. He led fiercely, and he finished the race with faith. You can too. Let his life be more than a memory. Let it be a model. St. John Paul II stands as a towering figure in the history of the Church and the modern world. Yet his life is not just history. It is a living legacy, a shining beacon of what holiness looks like in our time. His journey reveals to us that sanctity is not a distant, impossible ideal reserved for the past or the future. No, it is a present reality accessible to each one of us. He reminds us that holiness may take many shapes. It may look like standing courageously before kings and world leaders, speaking truth with clarity and love. It may be the grace to forgive even those who seek to take your life, like John Paul did when he forgave his would-be assassin. It may even be the quiet, unwavering strength of holding firm in faith and dignity when your own body fails you, as he did through Parkinson's disease. His life is a testament that the cross we bear, no matter how heavy, can become a throne of glory when offered with faith. As we reflect on this modern saint's extraordinary life, the question now turns to you. What part of St. John Paul II's story speaks most deeply to your own spiritual journey? Are you being called to the kind of courage that faces down injustice and fear? Is your heart being stirred toward forgiveness, to release grudges and love your enemies as he did? Or perhaps you feel the quiet invitation to deepen your faith, to pray more earnestly, to say totus tuus in surrender and trust? Each of us carries a unique cross and mission, but the same God who strengthened John Paul II is ready to strengthen you. Your path to holiness may not lead you to the Vatican or a papal throne, but it leads you straight into the heart of God's plan for your life. The saints of the church are not distant heroes. They're our spiritual family, guiding us by their example. Holiness is possible and powerful. Their lives show us what faith lived fully can look like. They remind us that to follow Christ is to embrace a life of purpose, sacrifice, love, and hope. So I ask you, what part of St. John Paul II's story inspires you the most? Is it his courage to face political oppression? His boundless forgiveness? His devotion to Mary? His joy in his suffering? Or perhaps his tireless love for young people and the church? Let us know in the comments below. Share your thoughts, your questions, and your own experiences of faith. Let's build a community of encouragement and strength, walking together with these heroes of the faith. If this story has moved you, if the witness of John Paul II has strengthened your hope, then like this video and subscribe to Biblescope. Join us as we continue to explore the timeless truths of Scripture, the inspiring lives of saints, and the path to a deeper relationship with Jesus. Together, we find light, truth, and purpose. As we close, consider this. What hidden saints are living among us today? The world may never hear their names or see their faces in the history books, but their quiet prayers, sacrifices, and acts of love ripple through eternity. Would we recognize them if we saw them? Are we open to seeing holiness in unexpected places? In the neighbor who perseveres through hardship, in the coworker who quietly forgives, in the parent who sacrifices daily, or the young person boldly living their faith in a challenging world? St. John Paul II's life challenges us not only to imitate his witness, but to open our eyes and hearts to the saints walking beside us every day. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the life of a modern-day saint whose legacy continues to inspire millions. Until next time, may you walk boldly in faith, courage, and love. Remember to like, subscribe, and share your reflections below. Together, we grow stronger in the faith.